Tonight, part one, and Hellenized Jewish diaspora, ? I know we're asking lots of questions, but that's how you get answers. A lot of these next few messages, well, I don't know. I could change the titles because it'd probably get a little monotonous on the tape list with a lot of titles with nothing but question marks after them. But that's the way I have it planned anyway in the future. A lot of questions that we're asking that we're attempting to answer. Now, I'm willing to talk just as quickly as I can and put as much material into an hour as possible tonight so that we're that much further along. But I know that it will I know that it won't go beyond next week, part two, and Hellenized Jewish diaspora. And we may, in fact, have time to jump into something else. And the more, the better. So, an Hellenized Jewish diaspora, ? Part one tonight. Now, in answering this question, there are about two basic options. One is yes and one is no. Let's start with the yes one and kind of give you a broad outline of it, then the no one, a broad outline, then come back to the yes one and deal with it specifically in detail, what their arguments are. Were the Jews of the diaspora thoroughly Hellenized? One position says yes, they lost the faith of their fathers. They were thoroughly Hellenized. They became very worldly because of their experience in Gentile lands. So this group of people on this side of the question would see the Jews of the diaspora as profoundly influenced by Hellenism. And we discussed last week what we mean by Hellenism. And therefore indebted to that not only cultural way of life, but that intellectual and spiritual way of life as well. Now, it's impossible for me to characterize the different people or the different scholars who have held to this position. If I did try to characterize them, it'd be a caricature, which would be unfair, because many different people, liberals, conservatives, blacks, whites, north, south, American, overseas, many different types of people, scholars. Of course, if you're not a scholar, you may not be that interested in this question, but many different types of scholars from different religious backgrounds have held to this position. So in other words, there's no general way I can characterize the people who hold to this position. It'd be unfair to say, now, these are the liberals that hold this position, or to say these are the hyper-conservatives. It just won't work. You find different people from different groups who have said yes to tonight's question. And Hellenized Jewish diaspora, ? To be honest with you, I held in the past to this position concerning the Jews who went to Babylon, and I still hold to that position. I think that here we have a unique case when the Jews went over in 586, as well as the earlier two captivities, to Babylon. As we see from just reading the post-exilic books of the Old Testament, they became thoroughly imbued with a foreign culture. Now, to be sure, it wasn't Greek culture yet, but thoroughly imbued with that worldly spirit, and they did indeed lose the faith of their forefathers. That has been my position in the past, and that is still my position today. I think that a lot of lay Christians believe the answer to this question should be yes. On what basis? Well, just maybe from their own study, that it would only make sense if this happened to the Jews who went to Babylon, then why not have the same situation occur with the Jews who went into whatever part of the Gentile-dominated world? And not a few scholars, including some important ones, including some recently, have held to this position. And one of the chief men, I'll give you his name here in just a moment. And then the other side to this question would be no. So you could call this the no, letter B or number 2. The no position, where the Jews of the diaspora Hellenized, no. And here's kind of an outline of what this group would say, which happens to be the group that I'm a part of, and I can demonstrate this to be the true position from history. These people would accept the inevitability of a superficial influence of the Jews who have been spread out into the Gentile world in areas mostly external and areas primarily non-essential, while maintaining that the Jews of the diaspora remained thoroughly Jewish at heart. Now that, in a nutshell, is what history informs us to be true, and therefore that's what I believe, and that's what I hope to demonstrate over the next few weeks. Here, these people would accept the inevitability of a superficial, external, non-essential influence. Externals would include such things as the use of the Greek language. We know that the Jews all over the world did adopt the Greek language. Well, that's a non-essential, superficial area of influence. The use of the Greek language in the naming of children, which we do find in the New Testament documents. Dress, perhaps some games, some scientific advancement. I mean, it doesn't matter who you are, from what religious persuasion you've come, you're going to probably enter in, unless you're just totally not of this world, like maybe the Amish are down in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. If others around you, including the pagans, have some type of advancement scientifically, you'll probably enter into that to some degree. Now, there perhaps is a breaking off line where you don't go, but for the most part, the Jews have entered into any scientific advancements of the pagans around them. As well as, finally, I might add as another external, the use of human and animal figures in decoration, and we'll explain what I mean by that later on. So here, we're willing to admit, inevitably, the Jews are touched by the people around them. If they're not going to be, they must needs altogether go out of the world, or live in a cave, or as Anthony did, live on top of a 40-foot pillar in the desert and haul rainwater up and whatever's supposed to go down with a rope and a bucket. But the Jews didn't do that. They lived in the world, and they lived of the world in some sense, but the of is only a superficial of. Throughout it all, however, the Jews of the diaspora remained thoroughly Jewish at heart. And by Jewish, we mean they didn't forsake the faith of their fathers. They might have combed their hair differently, their shoes might have looked a little different, they might have spoken in a foreign tongue, but they did not forsake the faith of their fathers. Now, do you see what I'm going to be arguing for here? I'm talking about the Jews in all of these cities, Rome and Athens and Alexandria and Babylon, wherever. I'm going to be maintaining that these are Jewish people, thoroughly Jewish people who are trained in the law, Jewish people who believe the law, and for the most part, most of them do their best to maintain the law in their life. So I'm of that persuasion, so we'll come to that as an alternative secondly. Now let's go back and look in some detail tonight. In the first place, the yes option. The yes option. Here we're going to look at their actual specific arguments. Earlier I've just given you a kind of a broad outline. Now, different people have held to this for different reasons. We don't need to get into all the reasons the scholars hold to this. I mean, people have reasons for doing it. If you hold to it, because if you hold to this, then it's going to help you prove something else somewhere else in your whole scheme of theology or the study of history or something. So they have their reasons why, but history will prove them to be wrong in holding to the yes option, that the Jews of the diaspora thoroughly adopted the pagan customs around them. Now, one of the more recent scholars who holds to this position is E.R. Goodnough. Goodnough. E.R. Goodnough. Not well known because this is in, these highly technical areas. E.R. Goodnough, in his book Jewish Symbols in the Greco-Roman Period. I say book, it's in 13 volumes. He has a lot to say about the matter. E.R. Goodnough, Jewish Symbols in the Greco-Roman Period. Please don't rush out and obtain this set. You will be wasting your money. In 13 volumes. They began to be published in the year 1953, so I mean very recently and in the years following. Of course, you don't write 13 volumes in 1 year, but that's when the first one came out. And notice that the title to the work, that'll become significant here in a few moments. Jewish Symbols in the Greco-Roman Period in 13 volumes. Now, here are some of the points, not only of his discussion, but of other people's discussion who hold to this view. I'm just going to give you Goodno's name as maybe the one who has written most extensively about the matter in opting for the yes side. Yes, the Jews are very much influenced by those around them. But in giving you some of the points of the argument, I don't intend to imply that what I say is exactly what Goodno has argued. Some of the points will be. But some of the points will be points he might have made, but maybe they're more taken from someone else's writing who wrote more about that or more in that area. Both, of course, still being on the yes side of the issue that the Jews are Hellenized thoroughly. And so however you're listing on your paper, then number 1 under this first option, or letter A under number 1, this first option. I'll look at several points here under the yes option. These are all points of discussion, what they think are in their favor. First of all, I would simply entitle Philo, P-H-I-L-O, or Philo, however you want to pronounce the name. Philo, the Jewish writer of Alexandria. Now, it's often said, you just read this all the time. You read it in Old Testament books that are kind of rounding out, so you're getting up into the IT period, or books specifically on the intertestamental period, or New Testament books that first of all have an introduction to the period between the Testaments to get you going. I mean, you'll run across it in various places. A statement, something along the line of the fact that Philo was a thoroughly Hellenized Jewish writer who had adopted the philosophy of the pagans around him and who had lost the faith of his fathers. These are my terms, of course, but that's essentially what you'll find. You just see that all the time. That Philo, even with the name Philo, which is not a good Jewish name, but even with the name Philo, we see that this man, whom we know to be a Jew, was a thoroughly Hellenized Jewish writer. With the point being, he's, of course, not living in Israel, he lives down in Egypt. And so that proves, in other words, he's like a barometer. And that proves whatever Hellenistic temperature he has, that must be true of the entire Jewish diaspora world. Well, we would first of all, we'll get later to the fact that even assuming that Philo was like that, then you're painting with probably too broad of a brush to characterize the whole Jewish world like this just because this one man was. But let's start with this one man. I don't even know that people can take it that far if we stay true to the facts concerning Philo himself. Philo is a difficult figure to interpret. If you get his, like in the Loeb Library, which has all the classics, the Greek classics and the Roman classics and Josephus' writings and Philo and all of this, if you get Philo's volumes and you read some of what Philo has to say, most scholars are willing to admit that Philo is a rather enigmatic figure. He's rather difficult. He is an enigma to interpret and to understand. We will grant that he does use Greek philosophy in such a way as to show that I think he has more than just a superficial knowledge of it. I mean, you could use terms because your opponents use them, and your use of them would probably be a rather superficial use, which would then tend to prove that you've not bought into that way of life. He does use Greek philosophy. He uses it so extensively, it's as though he's rather familiar with that which he uses. He seems to grasp it very well. Perhaps he's even sympathetic with it. But there is something that Philo places before and prizes above this, and that is his Jewishness. You see, the one point we must remember before anyone, or we allow anyone to use Philo, this is probably the most important point that can be used in favor of this yes option. And what we need to remember before we use or before we allow anyone else to use Philo to prove this point is to remember the purpose of Philo's writings. Why in the world is Philo writing? Is Philo trying to convince his Jewish readers of the superior way of Hellenism? No, that's not true. I mean, no one, not even the people who hold to the yes side would say that because, well, that's blatantly a lie. Well, maybe he's writing to Greek writers or readers. Oh, yes, now you're right. He is writing to Greek readers. And so if he is so Hellenized, I doubt he'd be trying to write to Greek readers and Hellenize them. They're already Hellenized. His audience is a Greek audience, not a Jewish audience. But Philo's purpose in writing was not to try to develop some philosophy that acceptably blends Hellenism and Judaism, but Philo's purpose was to commend Judaism to the Greek mind. Now that's crucial to any interpretation of Philo, his purpose. He is a Jewish apologist, to use the technical term. He is not a compromiser of the faith. He is a Jewish apologist writing to a very Hellenized Greek Gentile audience, attempting to commend Judaism to their mind. Now, what Goodnow tries to do, he does use the Philo argument and majors on it in a rather lengthy section. He tries to frame the diaspora religion as a syncretism, between Judaism and Hellenism. And Philo's philosophy is somewhat of a mystery religion. But I think he's gone a little far there. As a matter of fact, I know he has. Goodnow has gone much too far to characterize the Jewish diaspora religion as a syncretism, a false, unbiblical combination of Judaism of the Old Testament and the current philosophy of the Greeks, or to characterize Philo's philosophy as some sort of mysterion or mystery religion. No, what we've got to remember is the fact that Philo is trying to persuade the Greeks of the truth of Judaism. Now, if you're writing to Greeks, you live in a Greek environment, and you're attempting to persuade them of Judaism, and yet you've given it up because you yourself are thoroughly Hellenized, then we've got something that whenever you get to the bottom of the line and total all the numbers up, you don't make any sense at all. If he's lost his faith, why would he be trying to share his faith with people that aren't interested in his faith? That wouldn't make any sense at all. The only reason that Philo is writing is because he is proud of his Jewishness. He believes it has something to offer the pagan world. And so if he is so Hellenized, he wouldn't be thinking this way. See, I don't know why Goodnow missed this basic criterion here. You've got to understand the very purpose for which Philo is writing. He is a man who is proud to be a Jew, who thinks that the Jewish way of life is the supreme way of life among men. And he wants to commend that way of life to a fallen world and to a Greek mind. And so if people then ask, well, why is it that sometimes he does seem to slip over into Greek philosophy or whatever? Well, I think that in real life our experience would show us this, that often the one doing the witness comes so close to the one to whom he's witnessing that in his zeal to communicate he slips over into their side or their position. Or, to say it another way, and not as critical or as extreme as that, if he is going to try to convince the Hellenist of the Jewish way of life, he's probably got to at least be able to communicate with them in their language and with their philosophy. In other words, in order to critique, you see, if you're going to offer Judaism as the superior way of life, that means you're criticizing Hellenism. And in order to critique something, Hellenism, you've got to know what its tenets are then. And Philo has studied it so well, he seems to thoroughly understand what Greek philosophy is all about. He uses it all the time. Yes, he does allegorize a whole lot, but so what? What's new? The rabbis right in Jerusalem are using the same method of interpretation, allegory. So, and that's another thing always argued. Well, he uses allegory, and the allegory came from the Greeks, and so that shows... Well, no, that's not even true in the first place, because the people using allegory almost as much as Philo are the rabbinical leaders, the court of the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem, Israel. And then if we're going to call them Hellenized, well, I guess we could, but then what we've just done is we've thrown out this question, because there's no dichotomy between Palestine and its Judaism and the diaspora and its Judaism. You're simply claiming that all of Judaism is Hellenized. And I guess that claim could be made, but that really won't stand up under the scrutiny and the weight of history either. So Philo does use a lot of philosophy, but it's because he is trying to reach people who are in that. He has to study their position in order to refute it. And whatever might be concluded about Philo, as I have said earlier in my remarks concerning his statements on circumcision. If you remember back several months ago, Philo seems to fall within the pale of Jewish orthodoxy. He's simply trying to take Judaism and go a little further. He's simply trying to take Judaism to a people that are not accustomed to that way of thinking or that way of living at all. And he has to make a concession somewhere along the line. And if he wants to rearrange his Jewish phraseology and then adopt some Hellenistic philosophy, then that's just what Philo has to do, he feels, in order to effectively commend his way of life, Judaism, to the Greek mind. And so let's take this issue and go a little further. Let's assume, just for sake of argument, that Philo was thoroughly Hellenized. We know him not to be, from what I've just given you. Do you understand my argument so far? Just his purpose destroys his whole theory. You would not be writing, I mean, if you were what? If you were a former Episcopalian, and you got out of that because you were thoroughly one to the Baptist side, you wouldn't be writing to the Baptists defending Episcopalianism then. That wouldn't make any sense at all. Now, if you were still in it, you might use Baptist terminology, subtly or with deceit to trick the Baptists into Episcopalian doctrine because you're still in it. That would be another matter. And essentially, although that's probably kind of an oversimplification of the extensive writings of Philo, that is what we have on our hands with this man. But let's turn it around and assume that he's thoroughly Hellenized. Then does that in itself give us any reliable information about the entire Jewish diaspora world? Hardly. Here we have a single man. Philo is a unique individual. Unique in what sense? He is highly educated. He possesses much more education than the normal Jew in any other part of the diaspora. He happens to live in the most Hellenized of all cities outside of Greece itself, Alexandria, Egypt. That makes him a different case, a unique specimen, one which will not serve as a reliable barometer for the diaspora community at large. You see, whenever you do polling, then you have to poll the average people to get the temperature of the water out there. You have to go to grassroots to find out what people really believe. You can't poll the unique, important people like the writer Philo. He's highly educated. He's a single man. He's more educated than those in the diaspora. He's a resident of a city that was by all means atypical of diaspora communities, Alexandria, because of its high degree of Hellenization. That would make him, therefore, an unreliable thermometer to thrust in the water of the Jewish diaspora community. Now, Philo himself in his writings, let's turn it around and then I'll say what I was going to say. Well, what about other people, other Jews who happen to live in Alexandria? It has a huge Jewish population. Philo stands out as one of the most important Jews down there. And his comrades around him don't like him very much. And they know him to be, however, one of the most important people there. So we could ask this question: what are the other Jewish leaders like in Alexandria? Philo himself tells us he's a liberal. And you don't have to be a liberal to the core in your beliefs. If you're just trying to reach the liberals, then the conservatives will call you a liberal right away. And maybe at the end of the day, you're going to end up being that way. Philo's not at this time, though. His fellow Alexandrian Jews, he calls, I quote, literalists. Literalists. See, now I'm trying to say something else about the other side of the man Philo. He's difficult, he's enigmatic in his writings, difficult to interpret. But even if we want to major on this city of Alexandria, Philo himself tells us that he is more liberal than the others around him because he calls the other Jews in Alexandria, the other Jewish leaders, he calls them literalists. So I don't think that we can use Philo as a reliable barometer. I think Philo is too conservative himself to use in the first place. And as I've just said, in the second place, he's just a single man and he is a unique figure. So let's assume he was so thoroughly Hellenized that he just threw away everything Jewish about himself and adopted the Greek way of life. That doesn't prove anything about the price of cheese in China. All right, here's a second argument. That's the argument based on Philo, which doesn't hold water, as I have shown you, I trust. Here's a second argument that we'll entitle Witchcraft and Sorcery. Witchcraft and sorcery, or magicians. Now this is one that Goodnow and others of that company happen to employ. They inform us of the following facts. There seem to have been numerous Jewish magicians wandering around the Roman Empire as greedy, itinerant soothsayers, medicine men, witch doctors, that type of thing. And since we know magic, all forms of magic, of the occult, of telepathy, of clairvoyance, of poltergeist experiences, whatever, all forms of witchcraft and the occult and sorcery and spiritualism and divination, all forms of magic were condemned by the Old Testament law. There's a long section in Deuteronomy 18 condemning by name all different forms of witchcraft and sorcery. Well, if that's true of the Old Testament law, and we've got numerous Jewish magicians wandering around as itinerants throughout the Roman Empire, that can only prove they've given up the faith of their fathers. That makes sense, logical argument here. We've got a lot of Jews wandering around as magicians. Now, you can't be a Jewish magician and claim to adhere to the Old Testament law. That law strictly condemns all forms of spiritualism and witchcraft and sorcery. So they say then what this argument proves is that they gave up, all of them gave up the faith of their fathers. You know, we even have a couple of examples over in the New Testament. In chapter 8 of the book of Acts, verses 9 to 11, we've got who there? Simon the sorcerer. And then over in chapter 13, if you'll turn with me there, verses 6 through 8. I borrowed this. I forgot mine at home. I got a little 7-inch ruler that I have to carry with me everywhere. It's like a comfort blanket to me, because I can't write in my books if I don't have my ruler. And I put it in one coat in my pocket, and then I looked on the thermometer before I left this morning, and it's warmer than I thought, and I took that coat off and put another coat off. Left my ruler at home. My ruler's a wooden one, and I've gone across it, to underline the book so much that it's got like a crescent shape to it now. So it's not doing very good, but I just can't give it up. But now my lines aren't straight in my books anymore. Some years ago, it's supposed to be a 12-inch ruler, but I broke it years ago, and that's a little 7-inch thing, and she's got one a whole lot like mine, except mine's an inch longer, though. 7-inch ruler. I need to get a real one instead of a wooden one. I just worn it into a crescent moon, though. But don't go out and buy me one now as a present, because I'll probably throw the thing on the floor and say, I don't want your trashy ruler, because I like the one that I've got. I'm attached to it. Now, I could, I guess, flip it up the other way and use the other side, but that side's been torn somehow. I got caught in a thresher or something, and it's all ripped, so I have to keep it on the crescent moon side. So I had her, what got me on that is I had her ruler here in my Bible as my marker tonight, to remind myself to give it to her. So I have to edit the tape and get all of that off of there. Where were we? Acts 13, verses 6 through 8. Acts 13, 6 through 8. When they had gone through the isle unto Paphos, they found a certain sorcerer, a false prophet, a Jew. Look how Luke is really clarifying who he's referring to here. Look at all these names: a sorcerer, a false prophet, a Jew. He's going to give him several names as well. Whose name was Bar-Jesus. That just means the son of Jesus. He gives us his real name down in verse 8. But he was the son of a man named Jesus, which was with the proconsul of the country, Sergius Paulus, a prudent man, who called for Barnabas and Saul and desired to hear the word of God. But Elymas the sorcerer, for so is his name by interpretation. Now he calls them a sorcerer again, withstood them, seeking to turn away the proconsul from the faith. And then, of course, Paul pronounces an apostolic curse upon the man so that you won't see for a season, that darkness will come, and he had to go about seeking someone to lead him by the hand. And remember in earlier messages in ITP how Josephus informs us that Jewish soothsayers beguiled the women of Damascus and tricked them into proselytism. So we've got several different references, Josephus, New Testament, other rabbinical works, of the fact that there were Jewish magicians traveling around. But in chapter 8 of Acts, we're not outside of Palestine in the diaspora. We're right in Samaria. We're right in Palestine. That's going to hurt their theory a whole lot, and we find what they say should characterize diaspora Jewry, we find it in Israel. We find it sometimes out of Israel, but we find it in Palestine as well. So what do we have to say about these appearances of magicians? Well, a very simple explanation. All of these magicians, and they were rather numerous, were outside of the mainstream of Judaism. And they were strictly condemned not only by the Old Testament law. We could say, well, they've forsaken that. They are strictly condemned by the rabbis. In other words, they are a large number because we're talking about more than 3 or 4, but they are a small, infinitesimally small percentage of Judaism in the diaspora. I mean, no one has ever been a fool enough to claim, that any religious group is pure among all of its members. You're going to find apostates in every religious group.
For the continuation of this message,
I mean, no one has ever been a fool enough to claim, that any religious group is pure among all of its members. You're going to find apostates in every religious group. You're going to find Jews in Israel, in Jerusalem, in Galilee, in Athens, in Babylon, in Egypt. You're going to find them all over the place who don't believe the law of Moses and the prophets anymore. We're not asking for the isolated exceptions to the rule. We're asking, what is the spiritual, theological temperature of Jewry at large? And to pull out of the rabbit's hat, if you'll pardon the expression, a few magicians here, it doesn't help anyone. It just confuses the matter because they are in the minority. And then a third point of argument, human and animal figures used as decoration. Remember the name of Goodno's book, Jewish Symbols in the Greco-Roman Period. What does he mean by Jewish symbols? Well, now we're here to Goodno's chief argument. The use of human and animal figures in Jewish decoration. Now, this was a point made very strongly by Goodno because of the fact that such representations have been discovered in synagogues and cemeteries, among other places. But I mean, these two places where we would think, if anywhere, religious orthodoxy would certainly prevail, we have uncovered human and animal figures used as decoration in religious houses of worship, synagogues, as well as the place of burial, cemeteries. I mean, of all places, we would think at least in those two, religious orthodoxy would prevail then. Now, you might decorate your home with something forbidden by the law, forbidden by the rabbis. But when it comes to your church, your synagogue, the place of religious gathering and formal worship, you're not going to be worshiping God, and yet your building is all painted contrary to Him. If you're thinking, you wouldn't do that. Now, if you're not thinking, I suppose you would. Many are doing that in the denominational world today, but if you're thinking, you wouldn't do that. And then what about cemeteries? I mean, that's the place of transition from this life to the next. You would want to have all of your tombstone carved up with paintings of human and animal figures. If God has forbidden that, He might just push the tombstone down on the grave and keep you, the soul, the spirit, and the body right there in the ground. If you want to go up or wherever, down, wherever you're going to go, to wherever God is, I'd think that that's where religious orthodoxy would prevail. at the grave and in your house of worship. And Goodnow says, well, you can't argue with the facts of archaeology and discovery, though, that in these two places we find decoration with human and animal figures. Well, then my question would be this: so what? Where does it say, either in the Old Testament or the rabbinical works, that that is forbidden? If it's forbidden and you do it, you're unorthodox then. But you've got to, first of all, you see, you've got the cart before the horse here. You've got to, first of all, start on first base and prove this to be wrong. And then we'll say, well, yes, if we've caught people violating what was right to do and now they're doing something wrong, then they're unorthodox. But you can't violate something unless there's a law to violate. Well, I think Goodnow has got the cart before the horse and got mud in his head. I don't know Goodnow very well, Mr. Goodnow, so maybe I shouldn't say that. I like to use that for Kenneth Hagins and Copelands and those religious fools out in the world. So I'll retract that sentence. Mr. Goodnow is mistaken at this point. He is simply mistaken. God never had forbidden in the Old Testament the use of human and animal figures as decoration, as the Muslims do today. I think maybe Goodnow has allowed his, overall Semitic notions to bleed into a particular Semitic people, the Jewish people. Now, of course, that's common knowledge among the Islamic people today. No decorations at all, none of God, no representations of God. They're better on that than Christians are. No representations of God, of animals, of human beings, nothing. I've been in Muslim mosques before, and when you go, no decoration at all. I mean, decoration as far as just, art and drawings and lines and things like that, but no animate creation. No animal, no person, no representation of God. Now that's a Muslim, Islamic technicality and law. But that's not true with regard to the Jewish people. God has simply forbidden their use of human or animals to represent the deity. Now, if you want to send a postcard with a hare, H-A-R-E, a hare on it, well, that's all right for the Jews of this time. If you want to send a postcard with a hare on it, that'd be okay. But if then you have a note under it, see hare above is my God, well, then that's forbidden. That is Deuteronomy chapter 5, Exodus chapter 20. Now we need to remember this because the Jewish people have been rather conservative in their use of human and animal figures in any form of decoration. And that's probably because they are very legalistic people at heart. They don't want to even come close to doing what is forbidden. But after all, in the Old Testament, they had cherubim right in the Holy of Holies. Carved cherubim made out of solid gold that spread their wings over the mercy seat. Now, I guess you could say, well, that's not either God, human, or animal, but come on, that's being a little technical. It's some type of being. Here's an angelic being, and it's in, of all places, the most holy place, and God himself said to do that. You see, God has never forbidden any representation of human beings or of animals. There were palm trees also. There were cherubim sewn right onto the coverings in the tabernacle as well as the temple. But God has never forbidden the use to the Jewish people we're talking about of animals or of humans in various forms of decoration. When you then turn one of those into God, when you use them to encapsulate deity or the Godhead, then you've profaned the law of God, and that is blasphemy. But see what Goodnow has done, he's looked back into Jewish history and he said, well, we don't see in the Old Testament, and we don't see in Old Testament Jewish history taking place during that time, we don't see the Jews doing a whole lot of artwork. That's true, and since we don't see them doing a lot of artwork, we certainly don't find a lot of appearances of humans or animal figures as decoration. But as I said earlier, that can be easily explained, the lack of those two in decoration, on the basis of Jewish legalism. The Jews are hyper about the matter When it comes to matters they can do that doesn't affect their internal relationship or their spiritual walk with God, of doing anything that would be in disobedience to Him. To give you one good example that's well known from the New Testament, what did the Jews do? God said you're allowed to give 40 stripes, not one above. And what did the Jews give? 39. Why 39? In case in the giving of them they'd lost count, and they happened to end up at the end doing 41 instead of 40. And so they did 39 in case we've miscounted, then the maximum it'll probably turn out to be is 40. You got that right in the New Testament, that they gave 39 stripes. And you turn back to the Old Testament for a reference to that, a proof text, it's always 40. And so you've got to come up with some explanation why in the New Testament it's always 39, in the Old Testament it's always 40. Jewish legalism, their scrupulousness when it comes to external type laws that they can obey without any change of the inner man. Keep it to 39 in case we miscount by one, then we won't have disobeyed the will of God. So let's don't use human or animal figures pretty much anywhere in case someone might interpret those to be representations of the deity, and then we would have sinned against God. So they kept the use of human and animal figures to a minimum. However, they didn't completely stop using them. They're found in the Old Testament. They're found in Jewish history. As Mr. Goodnow has pointed out for us, they are found in synagogues and Jewish cemeteries. But that does not prove you're unorthodox, because you haven't violated any law. Household decoration, synagogal decoration, cemetery decoration with human and animal figures or likenesses was permitted. Now, those are the three chief arguments. I've got plenty of time. I can keep going then, it looks like. The use of Philo, the use of magicians, the use of human and animal figures as decoration by the people of the yes side. Now, I have just explained why none of these three will work for this argument. So, my conclusion to this matter would be as follows. Now, I'm going to give you a sentence, which is my conclusion in a sentence, and then it will be followed with a because. I believe this is my position because, number 1, 2, 3, and 4. And this is my position, but, and then I'll give you the buts. So it's rather complicated because I'm going to say what my position is. Sometimes my positions are long. Here's my position, my conclusion, and it can be proven by history. So I know that you'll adopt it along with me. Of course, some of you don't care, but most of you do. That's just the children I'm talking about, the first part of that sentence. The dichotomy is false, which separates Palestinian from diaspora jewelry. I'm not saying jewelry now for anyone that's new. Jewelry. Jewry. It's a biblical word, as a matter of fact. Read it. John chapter 7, verse 1. Just a good way of talking about the Jewish people. It's a good short word. Jewry. Jewry. John 7:1. The dichotomy is false, which separates Palestinian from diaspora Jewry, ascribing orthodoxy to the former and heterodoxy, i.e. Hellenism, to the latter. Heterodoxy is just another term for unorthodoxy, if you don't know what that word means. The dichotomy is false, which separates Palestinian from diaspora Jewry, ascribing orthodoxy to the former, Palestinian Jewry, and heterodoxy, i.e. Hellenism, to the latter, even though such a view is popularly held by various people, including scholars. Even though such a view is popularly held by others. Because, now the because goes back to the first part of this long sentence, why the dichotomy is false. So now to shorten it in your mind so you'll know what I'm saying, the dichotomy is false because, but really the because comes after the whole sentence. And then let me give you at least 4 points under my because. And anything that I have already said earlier, I mean, I could just say because all the arguments to the contrary have just been disproven. That'd be an easy way of saying it, you know. All the arguments to the contrary have just been disproven. But I'm going to try to break that down and maybe say some other things. Maybe some of it's duplication. What isn't duplication, you can go back and pick it up earlier. But I think point 3 will sum it all up anyway. Because, number 1. Are you with me thus far? Shake your head or do something. Number 1, because Alexander's program of Hellenization penetrated all of the East, including the Levant, which included Israel itself, the land of Palestine. Let me just show you what I mean with our little Mediterranean world here. We've got Alexandria down at the bottom. We've got Greece. Of course, it doesn't have a nice, smooth shore like that, but we'll pretend like it does. Greece there. We've got Israel here. I'm saying this dichotomy is false because whenever Alexander extended his border and pushed Hellenism as a way of life, then where did this go? Well, we know it went down here into Alexandria, and it went up here into Asia Minor, and it went here to Syria, and it went over here to Babylon, and to Assyria, and it went down here into Saudi Arabia. But you see, what these people are trying to do is say, now this is one land, Israel, and these people are Orthodox here. It's because they haven't been touched by Hellenism. And all the Jews that live in all of these places, what we call the diaspora, they are unorthodox because Hellenism has penetrated here. You're forgetting one of the basic things of history, that Hellenism came right in here and influenced Palestine too. It wasn't a protected country, insulated country or something. The very beginning premise here of separating Israel from the rest of the diaspora is a false premise. Because what you're assuming in doing that is that all of this area was Hellenized, was penetrated by various expressions of Hellenism. You can start with the basic forms like the language and the dress and the sports and so forth, and go to the more important ones like philosophy, the way of life, and theology. It didn't touch Israel. The fact of the matter is, it did. We've got, for instance, under number 1 because, we've got Greek cities here. You've got the famous Decapolis, part of which is right in Palestine, although most of it's over on this side of Palestine. But you can find the Decapolis mentioned in the last verse of Matthew chapter 4, among other places. It's a verse that some modern versions of the Bible like to skip because it just gives geography, so they just skip anything that doesn't teach you. But it should be there, the Decapolis. What do we mean by Decapolis? What does that say? Yeah, 10 cities. Or 10 Greek cities in a federation together. Those cities were Raphana, Dion, Hippos, Abila, Gadara. You remember the Gadarene demoniac in Mark 5? That's probably not the same Gadara. Probably should be something else. But be that as it may, you're familiar with the term anyway. Scythopolis, which is the only of the 10 cities west of the Jordan River. Scythopolis, Pella, you've heard of that. Gerasa, Philadelphia, which is the southernmost of the cities. We call it Philadelphia today, but the Greek is Philadelphia, which is an ancient city. This was Rabbah back in David's day, and today it's the capital of the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan, Amman. As well as the city which would be maybe right about here, which was the capital city, Capitolias. It's an appropriate name for the capital city of the Decapolis. Raphana, Dion, Hippos, Abila, Gadara, Scythopolis, Pella, Gerasa, Philadelphia, and Capitolias. This so-called famous Decapolis. So you've got Greek cities here. What that shows is that the Greek language has penetrated this very area here. Then, of course, we've got the fact that there are Greek names for children, or for people, we could say. Found right in the New Testament. At least 2 of the apostles had Greek names, Philip and Andrew. And some of the others could be debated, I'm sure. There are other Greek names in the book of Acts. The Greek language is spoken by all, etc. Alexander's program of Hellenization penetrates even Palestine, so the dichotomy is false that makes a separation from this land ascribing orthodoxy to it and this land ascribing heterodoxy to it. Because, number two, the diaspora and its resulting persecution. The key word for the diaspora is tension. They were a people that did not accommodate themselves, and they were persecuted as a result. The diaspora and its resulting persecution seemed to more closely unite and rally the Jews around their religious heritage. It seemed to more closely unite and rally the Jews around their religious heritage. Isn't that true of all forms of persecution? The minority, the people being persecuted, the ones who are different, most of the time unite. If you don't stand for something in your group, you will be absorbed by the rest and fall into paganism. You've got to find what is distinctive about yourself and maintain that, and what's distinctive about the Jewish people, but their religious heritage, the faith of their fathers. On the whole, the Jews of the diaspora would never have forsaken their Jewishness, because to do that would have cut them off from the land of Israel, from the high court of Israel, from the temple, from the liturgy, from the sacrifice, from the priesthood. It would have cut them off from everything. The literal promised land of their forefathers, if they would have cut themselves off from Judaism and Israel would have cut itself off from diaspora Jewry. So I think we've given enough statistics on that in the past. That the diaspora and the resulting persecution seemed to unite the Jews around the common denominator, their religious faith and heritage, rather than scatter them out into the world and scatter them to the point of adopting its ways. Because, number three, there appears no concrete evidence of a widespread diaspora heterodoxy or apostasy. Local examples, yes. Widespread, no. Across the board, no. We're painting too broadly. There's no concrete evidence. Philo, the magicians, human and animal figures used as decoration. To the contrary, there is no concrete evidence. That's not evidence. That's interesting material. That's not concrete evidence that proves your case, though. So that leaves those people with nothing but an argument from silence then. If you don't have anything, if I'm going to believe, yes, the Jews were absorbed into the mainstream of the Greek way of living, then I'm going to have some evidence for that. And we won't let you have Philo, the magicians, or human and animal figures used as decoration for evidence, because that won't work. So, point 4, what's your next point? They don't really have anything else to say. Those are the three best points they can bring up, and those three just don't work. Now, I know I'm making this, like rather cataclysmic confrontation here between us and them. We're not going to go on a crusade and decapitate those who hold the other position. I mean, it's not that important. But if we're going to believe that side, we have to have factual evidence that can be borne out by a historical study. There's no concrete evidence. And because, fourthly, and this is my final point under because, the fundamentals of Judaism manifestly appear intact in the diaspora community at large. You don't have to write my words word for word if you can sum it up in your own more quickly. The fundamentals of Judaism manifestly appear intact in the diaspora community at large. And what do I mean by fundamentals? Well, here would be a list, and you could, I'm sure, make up your own, including some of these things. Monotheism, You see, the facts of a study of the Jews of the diaspora tell us that the Jews were monotheistic. But the people who lived right next door to them were not. Now, if that Hellenistic culture was so penetrating and it overtook them so completely, then why such a basic distinction in such an important area as monotheism versus polytheism? The Jews remained monotheists wherever they were. And if you find a local exception, exceptions only prove the rule. See, that's what exceptions are. That's what's so good about exceptions. It proves a rule. If you don't have exceptions, then you don't have anything to prove that the majority was otherwise. That's what that old popular saying means, that exceptions only prove the rule. Exceptions are often very good to have. Unless you're dealing with the absolutes of God or morals or something, you don't want any exceptions then. But when you're doing a historical study, you'll always have exceptions. You don't ever have a case where there's not a single, unless you're only dealing with 3 people or something. So monotheism, another fundamental of Judaism, God's sovereignty. God's sovereignty. You know, the Greeks kind of believed that the gods could be enticed by beautiful women, perhaps minstrel music, or surely good food and a fine wine. The Jews didn't fall for that nonsense. Their God couldn't be enticed by any of those things. He was everything other than those things. His transcendence was too far above that. He's not affected by beautiful human women or music or wine or food. God's sovereignty. He is over all and in control. Thirdly, the Torah. Now, we know they became rather legalistic in their interpretation, but you see, that happens to be a point on our side, though. They're so wrapped up and so involved in ironing out all faults and difficulties that they've gone back and twisted and perverted the Torah, the law of Moses. But at least it shows they're in study of that. They're interested in that. That is a way of life for them to study the Torah. Even though they end up with twisted notions in their interpretation of the Torah, they haven't thrown it aside and picked up the writings of Homer to read or something. Circumcision. They go through the experiences of circumcision. They don't have to do that unless they believe the law of Moses. I mean, there's no physical constraint to do that. I guess it could be argued there'd be some against it. That is, it's painful. But nevertheless, they go through a circumcision. And another point, and we could go on, but these are really the fundamentals here. The Jewish people maintained their high morals. And that's what Josephus had so much to say about. That we don't have to put a baited hook out there to catch people. Judaism inherently is superior to all other forms of life and belief. Inherently, because of its morals, because of its monotheism, it is inherently superior. We don't have to put some carnal, fleshly bait on a hook to try to win the pagans over to our side. So again, thus far, here's what we have. The dichotomy is false, which separates Palestinian from diaspora Jewry, ascribing orthodoxy to the former and heterodoxy, i.e. Hellenism, to the latter, even though a view is popularly held by various people because, number one, Alexander's program penetrated everywhere. Number two, the diaspora united the Jews around their faith. It didn't drive them away. Number three, there's no evidence to the contrary. Number four, the fundamentals of Judaism remain intact. And then I'm running short on time, so I think I'll stop with that. But where we'll be next time, we'll pick up with this. And I went pretty far tonight, so we'll be able to finish this and start into another area next Friday night. But I'll give you some buts. Really, I have one down, but then I've got some ways I want to illustrate it from some other writings. Then I'll give you a but. This is the dichotomy that's false, and here are the reasons why it's false. But just because that's false doesn't mean we're going to go too far the other way in ascribing too much purity to too many Jewish people in too many places. And that, in essence, will be what the but is about next time. Questions all of a sudden. My, what did I not cover thoroughly enough?
You touched on the cherubim being used, and how does that relate to the Exodus 20 and the commandment of not representing anything in heaven or heavenly things?
Yes, but only if those images are a representation of the deity. God never has forbidden the representation of heavenly creatures or creatures below, animal or human, as long as we're not trying to encapsulate the Godhead in that.
Does anything in heaven, that doesn't mean anything aside from the Godhead either? Or?
When he said anything in heaven, anything on the earth, anything in the waters under the earth, fish, everything, you can't use those and say this is God here, that this fish is my God or this cherub represents my God. The cherub never represented God to the Jewish people. It represented a superhuman type creature.
There would be other reasons why not to do that now, though.
Oh yeah, if we want to get up into now times, we don't have. You see, the Jewish people had a revelation of what these cherubim were like. I mean, the cherubim are all the way back into the last few verses of Genesis chapter 3 in the garden. And God gave them specific, instructions on the palm trees and on the cherubim and everything. We don't know what the cherubim actually look like. That was a representation of the Jewish people. It wasn't a picture of the cherubim. And so what you have in medieval Christian art of little fat babies with halos and things floating around, that's pure paganism. I mean, if anything, that's contrary to anything and everything we know about angels. When they do appear, they appear as men, or they appear in some type of white garment. They don't appear as fat little kids. So that'd be wrong, because that's already a lie to begin with. And if you want to picture an angel, you're going to have to picture him as a man. But then what will be the difference? And that was the whole problem with artists during the medieval period. Well, if we just draw a man, even if we put a white robe on him, then how can you distinguish that man in a white robe, which is an angel, and the man beside him in a white robe, which is a saint? They had no way of distinguishing the two. So you got to throw halos or bows and arrows or clouds or accordions or something in there to show this isn't a creature above and not a creature below. But then when you get over in the New Testament, the New Testament's emphasis is entirely different than the Old Testament emphasis of worship, which was in one sense a visualized form of worship, not of the deity, but visualized in all the beauty of the liturgy around them.
What do you think of like an NIV study or a study Bible in general that depicts some of these things? Do you think they're helpful in their depictions? Or
Of cherubim? Cherubim? Yeah, I think they're helpful. Yeah, I'm not opposed to that. But let me finish what I was going to say. When you come to the New Testament, the visible side of it is drastically de-emphasized. They were never allowed to picture God in the Old Testament, but they were allowed to have a beautiful liturgy and the animals and the garments of the ministers and the lace and the blue ribbons and the bells and the Urim and the Tumim and the breastplate, and all of this was to symbolize things. And that is not allowed under the New Testament economy. God expects his people to be more spiritual than that.